Hello. Welcome to the first episode of Talking the Outsider. I am your host, Kinte, all the way live from Los Angeles, California. And I'm joined by my wonderful, beautiful co-host, the one and only Jen. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing good. That sounded super ominous, Kinte. All
Yeah.
the way live from LA. I feel like we're getting ready to shoot Batman.
Shoot him? Like,
No, not that kind of shoot. It wouldn't help anyway. No, I mean like film him. Everybody get your Batman voice on.
right. Okay, so talk a little bit about yourself. Just to let the people know who may not have seen us before.
Well, uh,
Oh,
I'm sorry. I had some technical issues. Okay. So I'm Jen. I am a former film student. I absolutely love television, movies, writing, and storytelling of all kinds. I've actually written novels. I'm very interested in story reconstruction or deconstruction and reconstruction as it applies to different kinds of adaptations. And as that then applies to how we learn about the world around us based on our stories. So every story that we cover, every series that we cover, every book that we look into always has to me some wider sort of metaphoric reason. Well, and I'll say this. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in this is because I learned very early on that stories that deal with fairy tales and legends and myths are oftentimes centered in our need to kind of deconstruct and understand the world around us. And as a result, I grew this very deep love into both visual storytelling, which I would say is filmmaking and uh, telling stories on TV, even manga and comics and graphic novels, all of that. And it really reached into my love of the printed word. There is nothing better than a good wordsmithed story. So that is sort of who I am and why I love to do this. I met Kinte a couple of years ago, and we worked on a couple of podcasts that dealt with some series. And I don't know what happened exactly, but something really clicked. And all of the series that we've done since then have been just a privilege and a joy to cover. So, with that same enthusiasm, I'm here to talk about Outsider.
yes. And it's definitely been a marriage, a very good marriage between us. And I'm so happy to be here with you to talk about all the stuff we talk about, but definitely this program, The Outsider. A little bit about myself. My name is Kinte Ferguson. We have a website called indieradio.org where we talk different topics. We cover different TV shows. We talk about social issues. We also talk about on different programs. So you won't have it all on one program. So we both, me and Jen, really love this material, The Outsider. I just completed the book yesterday. Jen read it probably closer to when it came out, right?
Yeah. I'm just as kind of an addendum, I'm a huge Stephen King nerd. I absolutely will read everything by Stephen King.
And I'll say this, like, I won't go into this because I've told it before on this. The first books I read was by Stephen King when I was a wee lad. So the first book I ever read for fun was The Dead Zone. So I've been reading Stephen King for a long time, and very looking forward to breaking down this series, The Outsider. Now, for this episode, we're going to cover the book. So we're going to give you a full book review. And then we're going to go into the first episode on our next podcast, and then break down episode by episode, trying to catch up to where they're at on the series. Now, just to let you know, we will be talking some spoilers about the book. We'll do it like more like the midway point, before we get heavy into the spoilers and what's going on in the book and how it relates to the series. We'll talk about that as well. So if you haven't read the book or you don't want to know what happens in the book, we will give you a certain point where we'll let you know where we're going into deep spoiler territory when it comes to the book. Now, I can tell you this, much like The Walking Dead and some other things, the book and the TV show veer off in several different paths. So we'll talk about that. But they're faithful quite a bit. So we won't go heavy into that. So I think a good place to start with this novel is just kind of giving a breakdown of what the novel is about. So I will read the synopsis.
Okay.
That the short synopsis, because there's like really long synopsis. Okay, so it says an 11-year-old boy's violated corpse is discovered in a town park. Witnesses, let me put this on the screen where I don't have to look to the side. Witnesses and fingerprints point unmistakably to one of Flint City's most popular citizens, Terry Maitland, a little league coach, English teacher, husband, and a father of two girls. Detective Ralph Anderson, whose son Maitland once coached, orders a quick and very public arrest. Maitland has an alibi, but Anderson and the district attorney soon have evidence to go with fingerprints and witnesses. Their cases seem ironclad. As the investigation expands and horrifying details begin to emerge, King's story kicks into high gear, generating strong tension and almost unbearable suspense. Terry Maitland seems like a nice guy, but is he wearing another face? When the answer comes, it will shock you as only Stephen King can. Okay. All right. So that's pretty good. Pretty good. So I think for us to review the book, a good place to start off with is that the basic premise is he sets up this storyline where you have a crime that was committed and you have a suspect, and this suspect they have him dead to rights. I mean, there's tons of witnesses that seen him with the victim the day that the victim, who's a young child, as it said in the synopsis, I mean, he's covered in blood when they see him. They got fingerprints, DNA, everything to say that he did it. So as they're doing the investigation, you find out, wait a minute, this guy has an ironclad alibi. There's videotape of him in a whole other place, right? And so it's like, wait, how can both of these things be true? So before we get into how possibly these things can be true, as the story takes us down that path, I want to start off with you, Jen. The basic setup and premise of this book, what did you think of it?
Okay, so I have a couple of thoughts just sort of right off the top. And I know that we will discuss quite a few of these things in depth in a little bit. This is not the standard Stephen King novel. There are, of course, elements of the supernatural in it, but it is at its core a different kind of story. And one that is a little bit more difficult to tell. So extracting what everything is about, and I would really I really think that we should do this sort of over as we start talking about who the characters are and what's happening. The thing that this sets up at the very beginning is an unimaginable crime, a crime that everybody would react viscerally to. There isn't a person in this town, and remember, Stephen King always writes about small towns, and this is no exception. Nobody would respond with a sort of tepid kind of emotion. Everybody has an opinion, and the person who is in charge, the lead detective, has such a visceral reaction to it because he has his own experience with it. So there is something at the very beginning of this novel that really draws you in and sets up this further exploration of many different themes, but basically pulls you in a way that says, look, this is not just this person didn't just walk into a drugstore and steal a bottle of hairspray or, something like that. This is going to affect everybody. And that, I think, is one of the first major big draws to it being really good, because it sets up the characters as excellent right from the very start.
And it has, trademark Stephen King colorful characters. Miss Rainwater, who I love that
Oh,
character.
definitely.
It was a brief character, and it deals with a lot of touchstones that you see in a lot of his novels, like substance abuse and recovery. It's a lot of that in it as well, and which is something that you see a lot, which is personal to him because he was an addict, and he's very upfront about his struggles. So,
Although,
mhm.
although I would like to preface everything that we say with, this story is foundationally about belief and a structure of thinking that defies rationality. It's one of those stories that you can easily insert yourself into, because we all have a fixed moment in our existence that we sort of center our reality around. We, as an example, know that something is not true, and trying to tell us that it is true doesn't always work just because you tell us that it's not true. There has to be something bigger. And so the core of the story is really about how we believe and how we come to change those beliefs based on either our environment, the people that we know, or just what we know to be true. There's this great piece in sort of the very beginning of the story where they set up, it can't be both happening at the same time. It can't be one set of situations and circumstances existing and yet the other existing as well. So there is a huge conundrum right at the beginning.
Yes. And just to let people know too, I didn't read the actual physical book this time. I listened to it on Audible. I'm sorry, audio book. And I feel like it's important to point this out. Um, Someone who voices a lot of his books is the actor William Patton. I put his picture up on the screen if you're watching the video, and he does a magnificent job of he does multiple characters. He's just really good. I mean, he's very good at reading these novels. So if and he did Dr. Sleep, the Bill Hodges trilogy, a lot of his material, he's recorded the audiobook. So I just wanted to point that out. And he really makes it, he adds that extra layer of awesomeness to it. So I wanted to point that out. So, all right. So going back to this book, one thing that is present in a lot of Stephen King's novels is the harming of a child in
Mm.
some form or fashion. And this one, there is, the murder that happens is horrific, right? I mean,
Right.
it's horrifically described. And it's just, and it's right off the bat. They put you into that. And you can see that the effects on this town, Flint City, on this murder, it just rocks the town, and it really sets up the events of the novel. So, that's, like I said, that's a recurring theme in a lot of Stephen King's work, and this is no different.
Well, there's also, I think, if you're thinking about this from a Stephen King perspective, it's the subterfuge of innocence, because there are plenty of, it's not just children, although children, I think, best typify this and for Stephen King anyway, sort of create that portal that he uses. But there is definitely a subterfuge of innocence that he explores in a way that is very atypical from most people, for a lot of that kind of thematic exploration, we're used to something a little bit more, again, sort of based in a different kind of universe. By moving us into a supernatural experience, I think in some ways it actually allows us to more readily be available to learn those lessons, to hear what he has to say, because much like the book, it sort of pulls us outside of our standard level of belief. So it's not like we're reading true crime and we don't have the same kind of absolute connection to it. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And I mean, it's, like I said, it's very jarring when you hear the details of what happened to this child. I don't know if we should go into depth with it, but it's pretty horrific. The kid is basically eviscerated, and there are some signs of sexual contact, not necessarily with the perpetrator, but a branch is used to sodomize the child, and the kid is bitten, and it's really horrible. So right away you can understand why people feel the way they do so strongly about this crime and its potential suspect. So one thing that is definitely a major aspect of this is the so we have our main character, Detective Ralph Anderson, and Ralph Anderson very early on decides to make a public arrest to really shame Terry Maitland, who's our suspect. And this is something that it's a huge moment right off the bat in the novel, and it's a through line throughout the novel,
Mm-hmm.
is his decision to publicly arrest him and shame him. And it sets a lot of things on course, right?
Right.
And one of the reasons why he says that he does this is because he has two patrolmen actually do the arrest, because he says that he couldn't trust himself not to, beat him to death. So, and then also, in this novel, Ralph Anderson and his wife have a child who's around the same age as the victim, who's away at camp, Derek Anderson. And Derek Anderson was one of the he actually played on the little league team that Terry Maitland coaches. So there's this connection there, and then there's this fear of, you know, did he do something to my child and I don't know about it? You know what I mean? So he makes it a very emotional decision to have him publicly arrested in front of his friends and family, and to put these charges out there. And so that comes up over and over throughout this novel, of that decision, and there's consequences for that. So and it's beautifully written. It's beautifully written what happens throughout the novel, but especially that scene, because it really shows you, like, how he feels, and he's a strong character. So going to Terry Maitland, and I want to reiterate, we're reviewing the book, so, and then we're gonna start reviewing the episodes of the TV show. So we're gonna talk about the whole book. Believe me, we're gonna let you know that the spoilers coming. So if you don't want to know or whatever what happens in the book, which I suspect it's going to be different than the TV show to some degrees. But anyway, so let's talk about Terry Maitland.
Okay.
The character of Terry Maitland, who is this, by all accounts, this wonderful person, great father, and such. What do you think about that character, Terry Maitland?
He's an interesting character from what we get to see pretty early on. I think that he, in terms of how he's presented by Stephen King, he feels a little bit like, at least early, he feels like a paragon. Somebody who is perhaps not above reproach, but certainly so far from this would be the person that I would think was a killer, that it stuns people to think that it could have been Terry Maitland. One of the reasons that I really love that is because it it sets into motion the townspeople's sort of reaction to this, in that it kind of splits them a bit and makes them much like real everyday experiences. They begin to start thinking more emotionally instead of factually, and that is quite honestly a little bit later one of the things that really helps propel the story in a direction. I won't say what it is because we'll get to that, but it becomes very interesting the way that people respond to him. The other thing that I really liked about the Terry Maitland character in the book is I really love the way that it is very obvious that Terry has this deep connection to his own children. And that is, I think, one of the cornerstones of a well-made character. It also works in a very sharp contrast with what we will see later with the supernatural aspect and how it relates to characters that perhaps maybe don't have children. It's actually quite good. So I liked this character. My only complaint about Terry Maitland is that it does seem like, for someone who is so learned and so perhaps smart, there are some intellectual choices that I feel like he makes that don't quite add up, and that's really my only complaint.
Yeah, that's something that I have some complaints about too, and we'll get into that. So when this happened, so another great character is his wife, uh, Marcy Maitland. And I think that she's very well written as well. And one thing that I love about her character is that she definitely is pro her husband. you know,
Yes,
she
very.
never for one moment questions his innocence. And she's so supportive of her husband, and and her children as well. And I think she's a very strong character. What do you think about Marcy?
I think that this actually goes back to what I was talking about before in the foundation of This Is All About Belief. She is one of the unshakable, unflappable characters throughout. She acts as a kind of bedrock in terms of belief, and it's not, it's actually the opposite, I think, of what some of the other characters go through. But she has such an unwavering support of what she knows as reality and how she is choosing to protect it, that in some ways she actually misses a whole lot of the stuff that we are privy to because we get to see behind the scenes. And the other thing that I really love about her is she has this, in dialogue, no nonsense approach to speech, which, if you've read enough Stephen King, there are characters that Stephen King writes that you can tell that he feels like he wants to kind of put a bunch of stuff into, and they end up talking a little bit more flowery, a little bit more like they've got tons to sort of say outside of the box. But this character talks in such a pragmatic and direct way that it's sort of it's almost like an interesting juxtaposition to the other characters.
Now, for anybody out there who's ever accused of a horrible crime that you may or may not have committed, it's very helpful to have as your best friend the top attorney in the area that you live in.
Indeed.
And so Terry Maitland's best friend just happens to be this guy named Howie Gold, who is like the attorney. He's the one that you go to get you off, and he's, very successful, and they're very close friends. They coached with each other. And another thing is he never wavers in his belief in his friend Terry's innocence as well.
Right.
And Howie Gold is a really well written, very good character as well. So he's another one of those really good characters. And he also works with a man who is a former detective named Alec Pelly, who is like his private investigator who, goes and finds out information. And there's like this really good play between both the DA and the police department and Alec Pelly on trying to get the information, trying to get the evidence. So they're always trying to one up each other, trying to find, evidence and whatnot. And I think that, that's really cool. That's a cool aspect of this novel as well. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And just kind of going through the characters before we continue, there's Bill Samuels, who is the Flint City assistant district attorney, or is he the assistant? Yeah, he's the ADA. And he's described as a cowlick in his hair, like much like alfalfa. And they make a lot of references to the cowlick in his hair,
Right.
which is pretty funny. He has all these old references, Stephen King, Our Gang and whatnot. And he's an interesting character too, who is running for re-election. So or potentially running for re-election. So he has a lot to win or lose with this case as well, personally. And then you also have, now this is one of my favorite characters from the book. I'm not going to talk too much about the TV show, but when we start talking about the TV show, I'll talk about that character book versus the TV show is the Yun Sablo character.
Oh, right.
Yun Sablo is a Mexican police detective who works for Flint City, who works with Ralph Anderson and on this case. And I love his character. His character is really cool. You root for this guy. He has a lot of insight into what we'll talk about a little bit later when it comes to what's going on in this story. And I just think that he's a really good character. What did you think about the Sablo character?
I can't add too much to what you said. I really like that character too. Although I will say that this is this is one of the characters that makes me think that sometimes Stephen King, as much as I love him, and believe me, I do love him, sometimes writes very tropey, and this is one of those characters that does feel a little bit tropey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't know. It worked for me though.
It does, and in this particular situation, I think it actually works really well because it's expected. I mean, part of the reason for using tropes in the first place is because we expect it and we accept it pretty easily. And so, yeah, going into that, the character sort of, it makes us feel at ease, I guess is the best way to say it.
All right. So yeah, I mean it does, and there's definitely a lot of tropey type stuff going on in this, but
look, if you're going to read Stephen King, you sort of have to overlook some of that because that's just his style of writing. It's not. I don't feel like you can attach any negative or even really super positive stuff to it. This is how he writes, so it's kind of a it's not really worth exploring too much because this is how he gets his points across. And I feel like that's just the expected Stephen King narrative.
All right. So we're putting the ticker at the bottom. So if you're watching this, this is the spoiler part of the novel. Okay. We're going to only spoil the novel in this episode. So just to let people know, if you are, let's say you finish, like you're getting to this podcast at the end of the run and you want to follow along, you might want to check this one out at the end. So we set up the book and now we're going to talk about the spoiler aspects of the novel. Okay. So so basically what ends up happening is they get this evidence that through this videotape that Terry Maitland was in a city that's 70 miles away called Cap City, and he was at a he was at a what's the name of that writer? It's a real writer, Harlan Coben.
Oh, right.
Harlan Coben lecture, and which was pretty cool, right? That he threw in Harlan Coben.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that he does that quite often, where he'll throw in other authors that are like his friends or that he admires and whatnot. And so there's videotape of him asking a question at the Harlan Coben lecture. And then also they find a book that only he touched in the gift shop, and they get his fingerprints showing that he was in fact there when this murder was happening. So there's this belief that this evidence could potentially exonerate him, even though the police and the ADA still believe that they had the right man. So when they take him to his first arraignment, Frankie Peterson's brother, I can't recall his name, so don't shoot me, actually murders Terry Maitland in front of the steps of the courthouse. Now, there's other things that I'm not mentioning, just because there's a lot of little details that
Right.
I'm trying to get to the details that matter the most. So there are other aspects that I haven't talked about. So just to let people know. But so when Terry Maitland is killed, pretty early on in the book, I just want to kind of ask you, what did you think about that? I mean, that was pretty. Did you expect that? Was it surprising?
No, and to be honest, Ollie Peterson, who had sort of not prominently figured in things, I I, I feel like that was actually a good way to express some things that are going to happen later. And the thing that was so interesting, I think, about that in particular is both the unexpectedness of it, but also we've already been given this teaser that it's very possible that Terry Maitland didn't do this.
Right.
And so to then have him die while still under suspicion, but all clues are pointing to, hey, maybe he didn't do it, is like just such an incredibly sort of climactic moment in that part of the book, because it really kind of gives us this, oh no, all hope is now lost. I mean, if he's dead, what does it even matter if he's innocent? There's so much that kind of goes into that.
And his last words are, "I didn't do this." So his dying declaration to Ralph Anderson is, "I didn't do this," and that makes a big point as well.
And I think at this point, Ralph actually is. He's not convinced that Terry didn't do it, but he is so full of questions that I feel like he is truly unsure what happened here. And so when Terry says that to him, I think it kind of gives him a motivation to explore so much further that he probably wouldn't have had if that hadn't happened.
Right. No, you're right. Yeah. So that happens. Terry Maitland dies, and also what happens is the Peterson family just goes into a tailspin. The mother has a heart attack,
Right.
Which happened before that. My bad. And then when Ali shoots Terry Maitland and then is killed in the process by Ralph Anderson, I believe, right? Ralph Anderson was the one who put him down. Then his father attempts to commit suicide, and he's not by hanging himself, but is unsuccessful. So he's in a coma.
Right.
So all these things are going on. So basically the Peterson family is like wiped out for the most part. And so now what you do is you have all this dread going on, and then you have Ralph Anderson, who is perplexed, and he feels guilty over some of the decisions he's made, and he starts questioning what happens. So he wants to find out what exactly happens, and he starts working in a way with Howie Gold. He wants to start having conversations with Marcy Maitland, who doesn't want nothing to do with him. She sees him as, this is the person who basically got my husband killed and ruined our names, and their kids are having issues at school and whatnot. So
the town is not reacting well to them because the town they're not privy to all of this information. I mean, they may have some legitimate questions about whether he was there or not, but to them, look, Terry Maitland was arrested. He was the prime suspect. And so he's still basically the killer.
Right.
And so, let me just interject something here, because I think that this is important at this point. It is not, Ralph is not investigating this because he thinks, oh wow, there could be something supernatural happening, or ooh, how spooky is it that this is happening. There's a pragmatic, absolute cop sense about Ralph, which is, goes back to a Stephen King trope, but it's a very hard line where his understanding of both rules of evidence and what is expected in terms of behavior of people, it's very well spelled out that he does not deviate from that. And he is like the quintessential investigator. He believes things that are supported by direct evidence. It's one of the reasons that he makes such a compelling character to be at the center of all of this, because his belief is what basically is shaken to the core. But it's important that at the very beginning that we understand that it's not that he is out there investigating this because he thinks that, I got to clear Terry's name, or it's nothing like that. It's that things don't add up. Things don't make sense to him, and he needs things desperately to make sense.
That's right. Well said. So, okay, so let's get into the big I don't want to say twist, but moment, because I'm getting to the main antagonist, but I'm trying to build it up to get to there. But I want to do this. Okay, so if you know a lot about Stephen King's novels, you know that he had a trilogy of books called the Bill Hodges trilogy. And those three books were Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, and End of Watch. And one of the characters that was, I'm not going to tell too much about the Bill Hodges trilogy, but the Bill Hodges trilogy, he was a retired detective who eventually started a private investigation firm. And one of his people that worked with him was a character named Holly Gibney. And Holly Gibney, who was a protege of Bill Hodges, is brought into this story, which, fans of those novels love that character. And it's a big moment into this novel because it ties those two worlds together,
Right.
Which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of, if you haven't read the Bill Hodges trilogy, it does spoil it for you, because I hadn't finished, I just started Mr. Mercedes. So it does kind of tell you some major aspects of the ending of the trilogy. So this, the Holly Gibney character, how would you describe her?
Oh, boy, that's a tough one. I think that I would describe her as this is a case where I think Stephen King did a really good job, and I'll make a caveat about that in a second. But that the Holly character is, I would say, almost the counter to Ralph. Although she is extremely centered in how to pull together a narrative based on evidence, she is also very open and very susceptible to different kinds of beliefs, and part of that is because what we understand about her is that she has kind of an exceptional past. And so there is I actually likened Holly to a kind of Will Graham, um, where she is
Are you
able
Thomas
to.
Harris fans?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the from the Hannibal series. And in a lot of ways, that's how she is. She is just, she's able to see things that other people cannot see or will not see, I suppose is maybe a better way of saying it. I liked her as kind of, that tool to tell us that part of the story, but there are definitely the Holly character is probably the character that annoyed me the most, not because of what she did, but because of the way that Stephen King interjects her existence to the other characters through. It actually kind of annoyed me because I felt like the other characters are far too critical in some ways of how she presents information instead of the information being presented. Does that, you know what I'm saying?
No, it makes perfect sense. She's used in this way. There's some evidence. I want to go too deep in it because I want the save people who want to read the book something to look for. But there's some stuff that happens in Ohio, and where I believe that's where her character is based out of. So Alec Paley, who is Howie Gold's private investigator, hires her. Well, he's looking to hire Bill Hodges, and he can't.
Right.
He can't hire Bill Hodges, so he hires Holly Gibney to look into the information, into the move about the movements of the Terry Maitland character when he was in Ohio.
And
And
they've had a previous relationship, right?
right,
I mean, they had actually worked together before. So it's not like he's not hiring her cold out of nowhere.
right. And I won't say why they can't hire Bill Hodges. You got to find that out yourself. But so what happens is that she, starts to uncover evidence in this case, and then she becomes an integral part of how this whole thing unfolds. So, which is very interesting. Like, she has an interesting speech pattern. I think is she like autistic or something like that?
Well, I mean, I feel like we're not actually given that information directly, but she definitely has some kind of intellectual and higher brain function issue that precludes her from being able to speak to people in maybe a more normal communication pattern. I mean, I think it's highly implied that she's like super high functioning autistic. I would say the word that we used to use for those people is a savant. Like, she is so incredibly smart and so incredibly able to see things that maybe most people cannot see, that it kind of borders on there's a genius factor underneath all of this.
Now, let's get to the main antagonist.
Ooh.
He goes by many names. Some they mainly call him the Outsider, which is the name of the novel.
Right.
But I think the internet loves to call him El Cuco.
He's the boogeyman.
El Cuco. So okay. So essentially, we find out that the person behind these atrocities, and there's others that tie into it, won't go into that, is this being who feeds off of grief and not I wouldn't say necessarily fear, but more grief and chaos and turmoil, and also the blood of children. And he's described as this legend that goes back to Spain, and actually throughout there's a version of this creature or this entity or whatever in all kind of different cultures. And the one that is closely related, they connect to it, is this El Cuco. And there's this part. Somebody said, "Who, Trump?" There's this part where after Holly's done all this research into what this entity, right? And it's interesting because people, they start to suspect something supernatural. Yoon Sablo is, like, I think maybe the first person to kind of say something. This is before Holly.
Right.
And so when she has this meeting with everybody involved, she shows them this movie, this luchadora movie from, I think they said, was it the 70s or possibly earlier? I can't remember. And it's basically about El Cuco, this legend. And it's a really good scene. I should have isolated some of that because it's really good in the audiobook, but you guys can check it out. And so we get these encounters of El Cuco, or the outsider. The first one, and this is the first time we're bringing him up, with this character named Jack Hoskins. Jack Hoskins is this wayward detective who's on leave, on vacation, and because after the shooting they put Ralph Anderson on leave, he's brought off of his vacation to come back as a detective, because they only have like 3 detectives in this town.
Right. It's definitely small town.
So one of the first things is they find these clothes that were left in a barn that possibly Terry Maitland had. So he goes to the barn after everybody's cleared out, and then he has an encounter with El Cuco, which we don't know at that time is El Cuco, but El Cuco scratches him or massages his back of his neck.
It's pretty violent. It's definitely, yeah, I feel like it's pretty violent. So,
and after that, he becomes kind of like a puppet of El Cuco, or how would you say?
So I wouldn't actually classify him as a puppet. I would actually classify him as a tool. And the reason that I make that differentiation is because he is very much in command of his own thoughts as well. It's not like he takes him over completely. There's a level of torment happening behind sort of the what is seen, and that level of torment is how he controls or how he uses him.
Right. So just so that we'll cut through it, because we want to we're not trying to tell the whole book, but you find out that El Cuco is in a transformation phase, where after he's taken the face of someone he set up for a crime, which is in that case Terry Maitland, he scratches his next victim, which is this bouncer at a strip club. And what happens is it takes, I think they said something like 24 days, possibly, for him to fully transform to the next person.
Right.
And he's very weak during this period of time. So he has to use like a surrogate or a tool such as Jack Hoskins to carry out some of his dirty work while he's making his transformation. And he can kind of project himself in certain places, but not there fully.
Right.
So there's a purpose for Jack Hoskins, huh?
There's a lot of reference to him being unformed. What's a good word for that? Sort of nondescript. And during that transformation time, it's almost like people can't quite get a fix on what he actually looks like.
Right. So I think this is a good part to just kind of get into the finale. Because, like I said, we're not telling the whole book. If you want to, if you want, obviously we're suggesting you read the book. So in this part, we'll just get into the end of the book. So the end of the book, by the end of the book, they figure out that the next person he's going to be is Claude Bolton, who is he's a ex offender. He's cleaned himself up, and now he works as a bouncer at a strip club, but
Right.
he's on leave with his mother, Miss Bolton. I can't. Her name was like Lola or something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
And Lola is quite a character herself, the mom. Uh, and she was cool at first, but then I think she kind of drug on. I think he fell in love with this character because he wrote her so much dialogue and stuff. It was like overkill. And so they, you have Yoon Sablo, Holly Gibney, you have Ralph Anderson, you have Alec Paley and Howie Gold. They fly to Texas to meet up with Claude Bolton and his mother, and because they figure that the El Cuco or the outsider is somewhere near, till he makes his change. And they figure out that he is in this place called the oh my god, it's called the it's like this hole in the ground.
Oh, right.
I know
No, I'm drawing a blank too.
fans of the book is going to be like, you don't even know. But I just finished it yesterday. I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's like this.
I'll remember it.
It's like this in this place in Texas. It's this famous place, and I think it's covered by a mountain, possibly. And they go to see if they can find El Cuco, and Jack Hoskins, who's still by this point is very ill from the effects of the poisoning that El Cuco gave him on the back of his neck.
Right.
Would do anything just to get relief. El Cuco tells him to kill them before they can reach him, and he has a sniper rifle, and he's lying in wait as they get to the location where El Cuco is down in the cave, right, in this hole. And at this point, this is when, spoiler alert, Howie Gold is shot and killed, as well as Alec Pelly, and Yoon Sablo is wounded. At the same time, though, he's bitten by a snake, which we laughed about yesterday. When I say he, I'm talking about Jack Hoskins is bit by a snake, and he's full of poison. He's bit multiple times. And El Cuco tells him in his head, that I can relieve you from that, the snake bites and all of that. Just make sure that they don't get to me, because he's weak at this point. And so they're able to. They have a confrontation that is Holly and Ralph Anderson with Jack Hoskins, where Jack Hoskins is murdered by Ralph Anderson. And then it's off to see El Cuco. So in the ending, they get to his lair, El Cuco's lair.
Right.
And he is still in transformation. So he's kind of somewhat still has the face of Terry Maitland, but he's transformed mostly to Claude Bolton. So they, have this conversation with him where, Holly calls him a pedophile. He's like, you're a pedophile. And so Ralph Anderson wants to kill him, but he's afraid to shoot him because the cave is unstable. So a sound, because when they yelled, like stuff starts falling, debris starts falling. So
right, it's super precarious.
Right, so he can't just shoot him. And so what ends up happening is, spoiler alert, is I believe he gets upset, El Cuco, when he's called a pedophile or something to that effect, and he starts to charge them. And Holly Gibney has, I believe it's a sack with ball bearings in it.
Yeah.
And she beats El Cuco to death. She beats him to death, basically. That's how El Cuco dies, because he's weak, so he's not at his strongest. And then when he dies, he starts leaking worms and all kind of stuff, and then they have to run from the worms, and they barely make it out. So that's how it ends.
The happy slapper.
Right, the happy slapper. That's correct. That's what they call it. Then there's this postscript of them coming up with their story because they can't tell what really happened, so they come up with a story. I won't get into all of that, and they decide to go ahead and live their lives. Yada yada yada. We don't. I don't think we need to go into that specifically, but there is a moment where Ralph Anderson, he has like worms coming out of him or something, but we're not sure if that's a dream or if he's now El Cuco. So it's kind of left up to is he now going to be El Cuco, or was that just a dream? So, and that's the novel. So what do you think? I mean, what do you think about that ending?
Well, okay, so it's not it. So the ending was a little anticlimactic. I mean, I do in some ways feel like it left a lot of not just questions for us as the readers to sort of mull and understand, but also just the cumulative effect of how El Cuco's death, or how it died, was, I don't know, it just felt a little rushed to me. What I really liked, though, and I know that this is going to stand in contrast to what I just said, there is something about ambiguity in terms of what was actually happening there that allows us to take the story to kind of the next level. And I do sort of feel like that is what they were setting up, or what he was setting up all along, because there is something, normally in a Stephen King story, we have the disbelief is something that allows for the terror to spread. And here we have the same thing, right? The disbelief allows the terror to spread. But what we don't have here is a really good sort of purposeful understanding of what we have as El Cuco's motive, right? Other than, I mean, we know he has to survive off of the blood, or whatever, of children, but we don't have the kind of internal motive that I feel like would have been far more satisfying. I mean, even in It, as crazy nebulous as Pennywise the clown was, at least when we got to the end, we sort of understood that it was part of something much bigger. And here, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you felt about it, but I just felt a little bit like, yeah, okay, it ended, and maybe I can move on and, try to think of other ways that this might tie in. But it never actually felt really super satisfying.
No, it wasn't satisfying at all. The way it ended, it makes me wonder, like, does he? Maybe he just does. He thinks it's more about the journey. He doesn't, because it does. He never. I mean, he very rarely sticks to landing. So and I love him as an author, but that's one of the things that not just me, but most people will agree that is the one thing about him, is that he rarely sticks to landing. So but like I said, I mostly enjoyed the book. I thought it was very entertaining. Until we got to the end, where it was like, there were some things that you had to suspend your belief. It's like, like, really, do people act like that?
I also want to point out that this book was written before DNA was kind of a very solid and instant kind of a thing. And because of that, it does feel a little bit dated. The novel itself feels a little bit dated, and it's something that I think we'll probably talk about in terms of the TV show.
Wait, this came out last year.
What?
This came out 2018.
No, I'm saying that when this was written about, not when it was written. And so it feel, and that, I mean, that actually works. It works in their favor because it kind of keeps us from being able to, there's a bunch of sort of things that don't quite add up in terms of the detective work, and the way that they kind of circumvent and get around that is, oh yeah, it's just not available. And that's what I'm saying. So it kind of feels a little bit like, they what's a good word for this? Like he put band-aids over some stuff. And that didn't really sit so well with me. But overall, I think that this was an excellent book, despite the fact that the ending was not super satisfying. I have to sort of agree with what you said about it's about the journey, because it is about the journey. There are so many awesome exploration points in Outsider that really give us a peek into, I think, what is a culture right this very second, where we refuse to believe facts that are right in front of us. We have an entire society that believes that the earth is flat. And how does that happen? Well, we get, I think, a really good feel for that based on the responses that people have to the actual the differences in what is happening in reality and what your reality allows you to believe. And there's something just so fascinating about sort of twisting things around so that, we all know that the earth is round. But what if tomorrow we found out that the earth was flat? Would anybody believe it? I mean, it's like that is how in your face this kind of idea really is. And to take somebody like Ralph, who is such a hardened police investigator, somebody who, like I said before, really relies on evidence and a kind of chain of evidence to prove things, for him to have to accept that there is something outside of the norm happening here is huge. It is absolutely huge. And this is where we experientially, I think, can draw some information we can draw some interesting ideas about how we behave when we are approached with information that perhaps doesn't line up specifically with our version of reality.
Very well said. Okay, so stay tuned. If you're on indieradio.org, or if you're checking this out, our next episode, which will be coming right up, we will be reviewing the pilot episode of The Outsider. And so we won't spoil the episodes based on newer episodes. So we're just going to purely talk about the pilot. And we'll talk about how some things relate with the novel and so on and such and such. So let's go to you, Jen. How can people get you in social media?
You can find me on Twitter at Following Bliss1, and you can find me on my websites at Critical Laughs, which is actually changing to Studio White Wolf, and moviesmakethemeal.com.
Cool. And you can get me at Kinte F on Twitter and at Kinte Ferguson on Instagram. And the website is indieradio.org. That's INDY radio.org. Peace. We will catch you next time right here.